First, I'd like to thank you two for the opportunity to speak here today on very important issues that often tend to be secondarized for other issues. My first language is French. I once lived in Vancouver for a few years, had many more opportunities to practice my English back then. Now it's not very often that I speak English. I was offered to speak in French and be translated, and I appreciate the offer, but not knowing that ahead of time, I prepared some notes in English, so I'm going to stick to my notes in English. I think recent NDP positions in the House of Commons on participation in military intervention in Libya and Mali contrast a whole lot with positions that were taken, I'm going to go a bit far, 22 years ago. Very, very principled position, anti-war positions by the NDP at the time on the so-called Gulf War of 1991. I mean, there was a UN Security Council resolution at the time which said that if by that date Iraq was not out of Kuwait, any country in the world was authorized to take any action to make it happen. So sort of an open invitation to any kind of coalition of the willing. And many people consider that that's the only thing that's needed, the UN Security Council resolution, which you can interpret more or less in any way you want. And at the time, the NDP leadership didn't go for that path at all. They realized that this was not based on the UN Charter, which indicates that everything must be tried before war, and certainly not everything had been tried at the time. There was a big contrast between the patience that is allowed Israel in relation to its multiple violations of all kinds of UN Security Council resolutions, and then Saddam Hussein's violation of Security Council resolution. So they're a big contrast. Things have not happened overnight in the change in these positions, and certainly positions on the war in Afghanistan were not always extremely clear, especially when it comes to calling on bringing the troops back immediately at every single point in time. In my presentation, I'd like not to focus on this war or that war or coming wars, but more on a broader issue, which is the rise of militarism in Canada's foreign policy and the rise of militarism in political and social life in Canada. Because there's a much broader picture that we have to look at if we want to understand what's going on. And if the NDP is going back to very principled positions of some years ago, I think it has to take strong stands on all of these issues, not just on this war, do we take part in it or not, or this other war. There's been a very serious rise of militarism in all aspects of life in Canada for many years, and this did not start with the Harper governments, be they minority or majority. It started before that. The role of the Canadian Army shifting from UN blue helmets to, I would go on to say, you know, a few extra units in the US Army. In terms of general policy, there's no more distinction between why we would intervene militarily in the world and why the US would intervene militarily in the world, at least not in official circles. And certainly the Canadian Council of Chief Executives in Canada has been instrumental in bringing about these changes in policies, and more or less it's sort of, let's be on board with every US military intervention or NATO military intervention without too much questioning, and in exchange, let's try to get broader and broader access to the US market and to all kinds of contracts, be they military contracts or other types of contracts. Recruitment has shifted from if you're interested in life to join us in combat, more or less. The Army is present in so many aspects of social life. The public relations budget of the Army is way, way, way up from what it was before. This is obviously not foreign to the fact that Canadians in their majority used to be fairly at ease with Canadian soldiers being blue helmets of the UN before. There are questions to raise about that too, but that's not the topic today. And fairly not at ease with combat operations in Kandahar or other military operations of this type. So the PR budget has increased a whole lot. The Army is present in most major sports events. The Stanley Cup travels to Kandahar for the Canadian troops. Major stars of every sport are brought close to the troops to try and attach some of the approval for these stars to go to the military. Most big family events, social events, have some sponsorship from the Canadian Army. Here in Montreal, La Fête des Neiges has which is some family outing in the winter to celebrate winter on the islands as some backing from the Army. I know the bike tour of Montreal was approached to have a military sponsorship. Most events are approached and most accept because there's serious cutbacks in funding for many festivals, many public events, and the Army seems to have lots of money to offer for sponsorships. So there's commemoration events. I mean, 1812, I think most of you know what the Harper government has tried to do with this, but it goes very far. In Quebec City's 400th anniversary, the Army was all over the place, on the Plains of Abraham, at the port, in all kinds of events. There's been in recent years a rise in the number of so-called strategic affairs chairs and departments and schools in various Canadian universities. University research is more and more connected with military research. New booklets of information for immigrants stressing Canada's military history, the importance of the Canadian Army and Canadian society. The new Canadian War Museum, special kits for schools, primary schools, secondary schools. I don't know if you've heard of the Tales of Animals in War, which is kind of a cartoon type kit, which targets primary school kids. It comes complete with a teacher's guide and proposed activities around Remembrance Day, and so we have kids here who are, let's say, the children or grandchildren of anti-war activists that come back home with a little assignment of true and false questions to try and find answers in that booklet of Tales of Animals in War. And having had an 80-year-old veteran come to their classroom and explain how Canada's military role is always very important and always for peace and for good. New Canadian bills and coins where there's a presence of the military dimension. Very deep integration of the Canadian military and the US military. This has to do not only with decisions about whether we intervene in different wars, but training, training of ordinary soldiers with different specialties, and also training of generals of military leadership. Our own chief of staff right now, having been second in command in the war in Iraq at a certain point, because he was deployed for learning in some U.S. unit that was deployed in Iraq at the time. So there's a whole lot to say about this integration of the Canadian military into the U.S. military. Another aspect that has developed is sort of total unconditional support for Israel in anything it does, even if totally illegal, obviously illegal. And I mean, again, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, John Baird went to meet some Israeli officials on occupied territories, which sort of a first in sort of giving some sort of recognition to the occupation of these territories. The militarization of the Canadian Arctic, military investments as tools of regional development, and the more you're sort of caught into this web, the more you tend to support the military because jobs are related to this, opportunities locally, etc. Increase of military investments in the Canada Pension Plan, Canadian Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade, the COAT, has given some figures on this. Between 2 years ago and last year, the amount of investment in military industries has doubled from the Canada Pension Plan. This is all happening in a context of globalization, neoliberalism, and a context where Western economies are declining in the picture of the world economy. And there seems to be clearly a willingness to use the military card as a very strong asset of Western countries, them together being, I don't know, accounting for maybe 75% of world military expenditures. And it seems that Canada, at least in the official circles, has decided to tie its destiny completely to U.S. militarism in this respect. I mean, at a small level, we see here in Montreal with the Charbonneau Commission, some companies, engineering companies, construction companies, not only using fair competition to get contracts, but also using bribes and also using sometimes even threats to other rival companies, etc. I mean, sure everyone here is aware that on the world scale, when it comes to getting access to mineral resources in this or that area of the world, getting access to this market or that other market, or other things of the same matter, fair competition is not the only means that is used. I mean, the military counts for a very strong part, and bribes count for a very strong part too, at a much broader level, especially since most of the time citizens in most countries don't really look that way. They look to local things, they look to education, they look to health issues, they look to housing, they look to environmental issues locally, etc., etc. This does not mean that people don't care about these issues, but it's rare that they become really key issues for them. It happened around the war in Iraq, certainly. That was obvious on the planet that it was a major issue, but generally it's not. People are looking the other way, and the powers that be do whatever they want in those areas most of the time. So think it's important to see that what's needed is a rejection of this militarism, you know, across the board, not just non-participation in this war or that war. A delinking of our military with the U.S. Military, getting out of some military alliances like NATO or NORAD, decreasing the military budget to invest more in health, housing, culture, education, etc. And internationally supporting genuine social and economic opportunities creation in other countries, as opposed to supporting our own companies' sales or offer of expertise to other countries, where most of the money eventually comes back into Canadian pockets one way or another. And priorities are not decided locally in those countries that we're claiming to want to help. So I think it's great that there is this discussion here today. The fact that it is sort of on the sidelines of a major convention of a party that claims to be very progressive on most issues, I think speaks. I mean, these kinds of discussions should be happening much more broadly within parties that have that type of claim. This is also happening to some extent in Quebec with Québec solidaire. I think Québec solidaire has certainly stronger anti-war positions than the NDP right now. But the platform about foreign policy, war and peace and all of that is only going to be examined in a few years. So other issues are always considered to be more key, more vital, which, I mean, there's some merit to that. I'm not questioning that totally. But there's consequences to that. I mean, the major consequence is that even those parties' memberships, and even the most progressives, they're only exposed to the dominant propaganda, bombarded with simplistic arguments, not really looking at the core of issues. What's into war? Who benefits from it? Who pays the price? These things are not really discussed. And even members of progressive political parties tend to gradually shift to the dominant views in society on these issues if they're not fed regularly with alternative analyses. And I see this around me with some friends that are very progressive on just about anything locally. And when it comes to talking about Libya or talking about North Korea these days or whatnot, I mean, we're offered like cartoonist propaganda, and that does not look into the issues at all. Doesn't even go on the streets of South Korea to see whether people are panicking that way as the CNN public are panicking. Or, I mean, there's so little true information that perspires on these issues. So there is, I think, a duty of progressives to insist that more attention be devoted to these issues, because once in power, it's not time to start educating your membership about things. You have to take a stand on this war, this intervention, and most of your membership will maybe even push the wrong way on some of these issues. So anyway, that's all I had to say. I'd like to end with just an indication that I brought a few copies of a publication we've published in September last year on the responsibility to protect, which is a critical analysis of that concept. And I think also one thing that is needed is maybe some unifying action, and we're trying to, in Quebec at least, do an annual White Poppy campaign around Remembrance Day, which is to focus on all victims of war, not just military victims of war, civilian victims being the vast majority of the victims of war these days, and also to remember with a view of ending war and opposing current militarism in our society. So this is a way of showing that you stand for something else than the dominant Remembrance Day celebrations. We haven't had much success in interesting any NDP MPs with this campaign. So if you have ways of helping with this, I mean, they're all more or less wearing the red poppy during the campaign, and it doesn't help explaining why we should be aware of this type of support for the army and for past wars. Thank you.
Merci Raymond. Bienvenue à tous. Cette réunion, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de parler avec Raymond sur ce sujet. Je vais parler en anglais pour maintenant. New Democrats can be grateful for many things. We can be grateful to Mike Duffy and Pamela Wallin for reviving the campaign to abolish the Senate. We can thank conservative pundit Tom Flanagan, the fierce opponent of Aboriginal status and native land rights. Flanagan helped to illustrate the connection between the consumption of child pornography and the abuse of generations of Aboriginal boys and girls. And last but not least, we can be grateful to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVII for making the public case for early retirement with decent benefits. Apparently, Social Security, like cleanliness, is next to godliness. But when it comes to the foreign policy of the NDP leadership, is there much grounds for gratitude? Not so much. Before the Orange Surge, the Parliamentary Caucus initially supported Canadian military intervention in Afghanistan and in Haiti. In 2012, the party chose Thomas Mulcair as leader, the most stridently pro-Zionist figure ever to hold such a position. Mulcair's caucus did not oppose Canadian and French military intervention in Mali. He was slow to oppose the bombing of Libya. He is quiet on the subject of Western interference in Syria, and he did not quickly or strongly oppose Ottawa's break in diplomatic relations with Tehran. So, if you don't see a pattern here, may I suggest a visit to the optometrist? Do you recall what happened in terms of the foreign policy debate at the federal NDP convention in 2011 in Vancouver? How many of you were there? A handful. Okay. So here's the test. At the World Affairs panel, delegates prioritized a resolution supporting aid to the Gaza flotilla. It was an action in which former NDP MP Jim Manley participated at the age of 80. He was arrested by Israeli forces and held for a week for his troubles. But seconds before the panel at the NDP convention voted on the content of the resolution, party staff and MPs flooded the room. Over 50 MPs and staff came into the room, and that was enough to defeat the positive recommendation of the policy back in 2011 that we wanted debated at the convention. To block debates on Libya, on Gaza, on NATO, the Foreign Policy Panel put two resolutions forward on military and RCMP Veterans Affairs at the top of the priority list. And guess what's coming to the top of the priority list at this convention? The same issues, veterans and military affairs. It also pushed up certain, I will call it motherhood, or should I say parenthood resolutions on accessible medicines and conflict minerals. Okay. To the dismay of many party activists, NDP icon Stephen Lewis gave a rhapsodic introduction to the foreign policy selections. Lewis bestowed his blessing on the murderous NATO bombing of Libya, purportedly as an antidote to the alleged mass rapes attributed to the forces of the Gaddafi regime. His pearly phrases brought to mind U.S. claims that Saddam Hussein's army had ripped babies out of incubators when he invaded Kuwait. Many delegates expressed frustration and anger at efforts by the party brass to silence new voices and to prevent open discussion of controversial issues like NDP endorsement of NATO, the NATO war in Libya, including the 3-month extension of the war by the House of Commons, which voted to do so, and for which NDP MPs voted likewise. What about Ottawa's role in the Syria conflict? In 2011, Canada's then Defence Minister, Peter MacKay, said Ottawa does not rule out military action in Syria. Speaking to the International Security Forum in Halifax, November 20th, 2011, MacKay postured as a defender of democratic forces suffering repression at the hands of the Syrian regime of President Bashar al-Assad. And taken together with Foreign Minister John Baird's bellicose threat to take, quote, necessary action against Iran, amid media speculation about a possible preemptive Israeli-American strike at Iran's nuclear power facilities, MacKay's words helped to form a rather different picture. It is the picture of extending imperial intervention, designed to blunt and reshape uprisings across the Arab world. It is the image of Western powers seeking geopolitical control over the world's biggest oil reserves. The business media call this saber rattling, but such noises led to the bombing and military occupation of Yugoslavia. Certainly, former and present dictators like Gaddafi and Assad committed high crimes against workers and farmers, women and youths. But those dictators were in the good books of the Western powers when they imprisoned leftists and smashed trade unions. And so are Washington and Ottawa's current allies who rule over Saudi Arabia, where a woman can't get a driver's license. Imperialism is always on the prowl for more compliant regimes, ones that would be eager to dismantle state enterprises and public services, ones that would be happy to sign free trade agreements with the vultures of Wall Street, Bay Street, and the City of London. The task of deposing dictators is the task of the people living under dictators. The job of working people and progressives living, especially those of us in the rich countries, is to stay the hand of foreign imperialism, of foreign intervention, and to disarm the war makers, and to demonstrate solidarity with those who fight for freedom and social justice. Another sign in the first week of April 2012 came in connection with the scandal over the price of the 60 CF-35 jets. Instead of arguing that Canada has no need for fighter jets, Thomas Mulcair said, quote, "Let's put the contract out to tender." In other words, let's get some fighter jets the government can afford, rather than invest the billions in meeting human needs. Turning to Iran, Ottawa's decision in September 2012 to cut diplomatic ties with Iran was a desperate political move to try to sustain a reactionary and unpopular policy. It had nothing to do with any Iranian threat to global peace and security. It was designed to counter the nearly total isolation of Israel and US policy in the Middle East. Clearly, Iran has the right to defend itself by any means necessary from the imperial predator states, especially the United States. I ask you to remember this. Washington engineered the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Iran in 1953. It fueled the cruel Reza Shah Pahlavi dictatorship for decades and sponsored a devastating war against Iran, 1980 to 1988, in which millions died. The lack of evidence that Iran is a nuclear weapons capable state does not deter Washington and Tel Aviv from making accusations and threats, resulting in the death or displacement of millions of Iraqis. The principle bears repeating. Self-defense is for victims, not for victimizers. Whether Iran has nuclear weapons or not, the real threat of nuclear war stems from the United States and its attack dog in the region, the Zionist apartheid state. Washington has by far the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. And it is the only state to actually use that barbaric weapon, twice against Japan in 1945, when the Second World War was, for all intents and purposes, over. American presidents have repeatedly threatened to deploy the bomb, chiefly in pursuit of their corporate interests in the Middle East and Asia, and also in the Caribbean. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962? Israel's nuclear arsenal is the only one in the vast Arab region. That signals the ultimate price that the Zionist establishment puts on terminating its illegal occupation of Palestine. Stephen Harper's hard-boiled Minister of External Affairs, John Baird, cites the repressive character of the Ahmadinejad regime. He accuses it of using diplomatic personnel to promote its interests and to intimidate Iranians living in Canada. Okay, to be sure, the Islamic Republic is deeply undemocratic and repressive. So was the Saudi regime, which invaded Bahrain to crush an Arab Spring uprising. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Recall also that the Harper conservatives intervened in the 2006 election in Venezuela by funneling money to the right-wing opposition. Harper's ugly remarks on the death of Hugo Chavez remind us of the thrust of his policy in Latin America. That's right, even the banner can sustain its reference to our Prime Minister. Socialists condemn all forms of oppression and exploitation, and at the same time, we defend the right of oppressed nations to national self-determination. We believe it is the task of workers and farmers of Iran to settle accounts with their ruling class, to replace the tyranny with a vibrant, pluralistic, socialist democracy. Canada's rulers could not be any less interested in facilitating grassroots democracy in Iran. Their interventions in Afghanistan and in Haiti, where Ottawa helped the United States abduct elected Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 2004, attest to that. NATO bombing of Libya, in which Canadian forces played a leading role, resulted in a US-engineered regime change, but it didn't prevent the murder of the US ambassador in Benghazi on September 11th. So, given that event, should Washington and Ottawa now break relations with the government they helped to install in Libya? Do they have a similar political makeover in mind for Syria? The government of Canada recently sent a CF-17 transport plane to northern Mali to add to the military buildup by NATO powers in the region. One transport plane and a few Canadian trainers, in quotation marks, constitute, in my view, the thin edge of the wedge. Is this another case of mission creep, as occurred in Libya? Is this being, and this is being done, there's no question about it, it's being done without any parliamentary debate. The Tuareg people in northern Mali have been waging a campaign for independence for decades. And it has been a thorn in the side of both the Malian government and those who wish to exploit the natural resources of the area. The borders drawn up by French colonialists were never appropriate to the needs of the primarily nomadic people of the deserts of the north. NATO's overthrow of the Libyan government has allowed huge numbers of weapons to fall into the hands of local militias, including the so-called fundamentalist ones. The Mali situation is therefore another case of blowback against Western interests due to Western intervention. The real reason for NATO's involvement is to secure strategic, resource-rich areas of Africa for the West. Canadian gold mining operations have significant holdings in northern Mali, as they do in many other Western nations. Canada's new interventionism, which includes the building of 3 military bases in Tanzania, in Senegal, and in Kenya, is therefore primarily about securing the area for foreign plunder. Canadian troops are already stationed in Niger, ready to launch an invasion. The NDP should demand that Canada withdraw from NATO, which drags us into every neo-colonial military adventure of the Western powers. What is the road to genuine democracy and social justice? My argument, the road is socialist revolution from within, not imperialist intervention from without. International working class solidarity starts with opposition to the schemes of our own ruling class and their state, and by clearly opposing the war drive of the Western powers. A crucial task in this regard is to strengthen the broad, united front, action-oriented, anti-war movement, of which Échec à la guerre is an excellent example. Our slogans should be, hands off Iran, restore diplomatic relations now, Canada out of NATO, NATO out of Afghanistan, no Canadian military intervention in Mali or Syria, disarm the war makers, starting at home, money for public health, education, housing, and good jobs, not for war. And we stand for workers' power from Iran to Egypt and beyond, and that will only be achieved by people-to-people support, supporting social movements from below that are fighting to change those societies. It's up to them, and our job is to enable them to do that good work and to stop our rulers from helping their rulers keep them down. That has to be our fundamental mission. The Socialist Caucus has won some important gains in the framework of political struggle in the NDP. In 2006, we actually won the fight to commit the party to the demand Canada out of Afghanistan now. Up until then, Jack Layton was talking about Canadian forces out of Kandahar, not out of the whole country. And was talking about redeploying them in some way in Africa, as if this would make amends or be useful. We won the NDP to a policy of out now, along with other anti-war forces active in the party. We didn't do this alone, but we drove hard on that issue and were successful. And we won the party to other important policies. For example, opposition to public funding for religious and private schools, for increasing the percentage of cars sold in Canada that are hybrid or electric generated. We won the policy that the federal government devote 2% of its budget to construction of social housing, and many others. So I'm just going to conclude by arguing that we can advance if we work together to advance a progressive, solidarity-based, working-class agenda. It's in our interest here, it's in the interest of working people globally. Together, we can do it. I invite you to join the Socialist Caucus if you're not already directly and actively involved. Together, we can win peace with social justice on a global scale.